Hello and welcome to Ventures and Visionaries, Episode 11, Mastering Growth Through Operations. I am your host, Mordy Hackel, an entrepreneur, consultant, coach, and solutioneer. This podcast is about entrepreneurship, technology, and business innovation. How do you use current technologies and entrepreneurship to provide leverage, ideas, and coaching to budding entrepreneurs? Welcome to today's show. Today we are thrilled to have Naima Jinnah, a dynamic leader in the technology and investment sectors, join us to hear more about how Naima, who is a former COO of ITE Labs, the cutting edge and data technology hub of IT management, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm specializing in industrial and transportation assets, has continued her journey and learned about operations. But before that, she also began in the legal industry in New York City, where she quickly realized the transformative power of effective operations, processes, and technology. This led her into the tech industry, where she developed platforms behind Prove, which was Payphone, and worked on identity authentication services for U.S. banks. She also had other leadership roles like COO at the revitalized dig.com, which was a social media platform turned content aggregator by BetaWorks. She also was a product lead at Civil Media Company and also worked on a blockchain project by Consensus. She has a lot of expertise in data analytics, strategic partnership, finance, product management, and team leadership. Outside of that, and hopefully we'll get to this as well, Naima is passionate about mentoring women in technology and operations through networks such as Built by Girls. She also collaborates with creative entities like Eyes Closed, a theatrical production, and The Most Art, an artistic collective, which helps bring which helps bring creative visions to life. I'm super excited to have Naima here. Naima, thank you so much for joining the show. I definitely want to hear a little bit more about you and your background, but welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. How are you doing today?
Doing great. It was really great to hear my experience and bio read back to me. It's so interesting hearing sometimes about yourself and you're like, oh wow, I did a lot. That's cool.
I hear that. That is definitely a very cool experience. But your background is incredibly impressive, particularly around operations, teamwork, and team building. Maybe take us a little bit through the backstory. How did you become an operational or focused on operations, become passionate about operations?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of walk it back to my start in the legal industry. So, my whole life, I was brought up on the track of becoming a lawyer, and being South Asian, a lot of our parents aspire for us to be doctors, lawyers, or engineers. And because I argued a lot as a child, or so my family says, I sort of started to walk the path.
What do you mean? Why? What do you mean? Sorry.
Why is my favorite question. Exactly. I moved to New York City after working in a political nonprofit out of Florida around the time of the 2008 election and around the time of the 2008 financial crisis as well, and decided to make the jump to pursue a career in law. And that meant working at small to mid-sized law firms in New York City. And there is where I became a paralegal, a legal assistant, and really was studying for my LSATs and, really sort of making the moves that, one should make if they want to go to law school and work for, big law at the end of the day. So in that context, unbeknownst to me, I learned what it took to run an organization, run a law firm. Being a paralegal and a legal assistant, you sort of see two sides of a corporate environment. You interact directly with the partners and the associates who deal with the clients. So, you're hearing, from a functional perspective, what the clients are, getting services for. And then on the paralegal or assistant side, you're seeing the backbone of the office operate. So down to, snacks being refilled, or how phones work, or how pieces of technology enable legal assistants to transcribe notes or transcribe depositions, etc. So I kind of saw this intersection of, business as it were facing the clients, and how it operated on the back end. And we had a tremendous COO at that firm, and she, really gave all of us really great training on process, technology, and even elements of data. It was early at the time, in order to inform how we supported our associates and partners. So from there, I sort of picked up on all these soft and hard skills, being in an office, being in a really corporate environment. And, at the end of the day, you can kind of look at corporate environments in two ways, or really on the spectrum, not in two ways. But you can start with extreme corporate, right? Cubicles, water cooler, printing room. And then you can look at it from a startup perspective, where you have, floating desks and bean bags and, Nerf guns, maybe, and it's a little bit more informal and casual. So that exposure to a hard corporate environment in the context of working in a law firm, I think set a lot of foundation for me, right? This is how a technology team can train, associates and partners and legal assistants on how to use tools within the organization. And as I transitioned into working for a mobile identity authentication startup, that Payphone, as you mentioned before, I had the opportunity to work as an account manager. And that flipped the script a little bit for me, because I was coming from legal and, really sort of corporate, strict rules and guidelines on how to operate, into account management, sales. Things are fluid. Yeah, we have some goals, but it's a startup, and you have to be able to kind of figure out how to do things on your own, and you have to sell, and you have to manage an external customer. So at that point, I kind of took what I learned from, sort of the foundational and, might I say, strict rules that came from sort of the legal side of things. And I was able to apply those lessons to a more amorphous environment, where it, was very startup. It was very loose. We didn't have many processes. We had a lot of teams communicating with each other, without really great processes on how to communicate. So as an account manager coming in, my job was not only to communicate with our customers, it was also to get information internally from the teams, which I was getting a lot of roadblocks on, right? It was a lot of texting and chatting, and maybe emailing is for sure, but there wasn't really any
emails
sort
for
of
old
tools,
people.
right?
Emails totally for old people.
Exactly. Not for old people, but definitely great way to relay information.
For sure.
But then it's up to the reader to be able to sort of sift what's important. So that was my first taste really into an organic entrance into operations, because I was able to sort of solve the problems that I needed to solve to get my job done. I can keep going to kind of jump into how that progressed, but that was sort of the leap from legal into
operations. So maybe we'll just let's dive straight into the process side, because I think that would be very interesting to the listeners to understand. How does an entrepreneurial company start thinking about what processes are necessary to empower the organization versus others that, and I may be twisting your words here in fairness, but create extra strictness and corporate and potentially the negative outcomes that everyone associates with what appear to be arbitrary rules and processes?
Absolutely. I think that was where, or I guess one of the key things that I learned about the point of failure of implementing the strictness, or sort of, the quintessential approaches to process, is not having a product first approach. So let's elaborate on that a little bit.
Please.
So when I jumped into this account management role, we had a product team. So this product team was extremely technically savvy, knew how to code pretty much in every language, and we're doubling as engineers, as a lot of startups have that approach. we had a finance team, and then we had a sales and account management team. And we were exchanging information about our customer through email, right? This client, has normal profile information, right? So this client is this big, has recurring revenue of this much. And that was all kind of being stored in email and then maybe in sort of a shared Google document. And I think at that point, I started to observe a lot of problems in the organization, communication problems, right? Email was kind of one of them. And then there was chat, right? We were using Skype at the time. So a lot of really valuable information was actually being exchanged in these chat, in this chat format. And that started to become extremely untenable as we started to scale, as we started to have more clients. So for me, my job was to evaluate what was the biggest problem. And if I solved it, would it actually bring value? So I think doing a little bit of an exercise of understanding my customer, which was at this point the internal team, I had to, kind of I had to sort of give them platforms and give them tools in order for them to relay information back to me. So there was sort of this customer relationship I built with the internal team, which is basically operations. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But, I had to evaluate the problem set and which solutions were highest impact, low cost, and highest value. And doing a little bit of that reflection of really understanding what the problems are and communicating and creating some consensus that these are the problems that we have to solve is where you start to actually get some traction in creating good processes. So in this scenario, I kind of laid out, hey, these are all of the things that are breaking. We don't necessarily know or have data on our client list, and we don't know how much market share they actually have and how much recurring revenue we can get from them. We actually don't have a sense of why we're approaching this client in the first place. So, a CRM was one of the things that we knew would be a little bit of an entry cost, and we had to create budget for. But creating sort of that touch point for everybody else on the team to enter information about a client and using that data to create goals and to create sort of a roadmap as to what our customer list or customer outcomes can be is, one of the things that really helped us. So in that case, we started off with Salesforce and quickly actually moved out of Salesforce and thought that it was actually not solving our problems. It was creating too much information. And so we pivoted to kind of a middle tier tool at that point that was easier to train, easier to set up, and was a little bit more out of the box. So again, it's looking at what the problems are in the organization. In this particular case, it was communication and not having a sufficient amount of information about our customer, and creating a platform that folks could actually, in an organized way, be able to track and communicate.
I think you said at least two and probably more things that I just couldn't hold all in my head at once. But the first thing that I observed that you said that is incredibly wise is that customers are not just external. Sometimes your customers are your own team, and being able to, I guess, differentiate who your actual customer is and understand that properly is incredibly valuable. And what you also noted is the exercise that you went through to identify the problems. And this is kind of where I would love to dig in a little bit more. And maybe even selfishly so, because obviously, at KJ, we deal with processes all the time. And I'd be curious to hear from a process expert, like, what thinking process beyond, okay, this is, I think you said you categorize the problems by severity, if you will. How do you go about identifying when a problem is core versus sometimes it's just a symptom? And how do you go about categorizing your problem list so that you can truly get to the root of an issue and hopefully your solution is addressing that issue?
Absolutely. This is where leadership and culture and management infrastructure is super important. So, having a shared, and people say this all the time, and I'm sure it's a bit of a dead horse, but having a vision is extremely important for, I think, any organization. And that vision can then trickle down into how you create goals. There are many goal frameworks that are great for an organization. And really, I always say you can, for your team and as a leader, you have to parent the child that you have.
Mm.
And it's not a one size fits all type approach. But, with that said, starting with a vision that feels that is culturally relevant, for your organization is super important strategically from a business perspective. And then creating tangible goals that you can measure against that vision. So, in order for that to, be applied, you have to kind of look at the goals, and that's how you evaluate whether or not a problem actually aligns to those goals, right?
Mm.
And that's what I mean by creating the prioritization metrics by high value, low cost, or high value, high impact. You can measure something as high value or high impact if it directly relates to the success of a goal that you've agreed on as an organization or as a team. So, the way that we did this in a couple of companies where I was part of leadership is by doing OKRs. So this is objectives and key results. It's a pretty common framework. I think perhaps Google may have came out with it back in the good old days for them. But really the objective is the goal, right? It's the map. And the key results, the KR, is how you get there. What are the roads that you're taking on that map? And that's super important because it allows you to measure the key result against the goal. And this can be a little bit surgical, and I realize that. So I think that there is a lot of room for error here. I think that being aspirational in your goals and having room for error is important. You should never be scoring 100% on your goals. You should probably always be scoring somewhere between 70 and 80% so that you know that you actually had a goal to reach up to. But yeah, that's where you define your problem set. You literally look at the things that are breaking in the organization and you say, I'm going to solve these 3 problems. I'm going to solve the communication problem. I'm going to solve the training problem. I'm just throwing some out there.
Sure.
And I'm going to solve, the cost problem because that relates directly to our ability to, say the objective was to build a more, a more enterprise focused organization in the next 5 years. So you kind of have to create that link, and there's room for error, and I think there's room for defining.
It sounds like what you're saying is that as a company matures and grows through their process of defining their operations a little bit better, they tend to be more systematic about the solutions being more at the core rather than having an issue in front of their face and resolving it today and then living to fight another day.
Yeah, exactly. I think we can't be afraid of the problems, right? I think that identifying problem sets, and this is a big part of how product designers work as well, which I love that framework because it creates a little bit of humility, I think, around being fallible. And that allows for improvement. If you go in and you say, we have goals and we're doing everything right, then you're actually creating a culture of fear. So when problems do come up, people don't actually mention them or want to mention them because fear of, I don't know, their bonus being at stake or fear of just the culture being, not accepting of failure or not accepting of mistakes. I think that's when you create, essentially not being able to identify the problems that you could be solving.
Interesting. So that is so rich. That is so rich because there's, the emotional component, there's the self-reflection component, and there is the actual method by which you go about doing what you're doing. But maybe I can take a step back for 1 second. And you said something about OKRs and goals, and you defined them well. So yes. I don't need to repeat that. So I appreciate that. And I will also say that you've described your benchmark as around 80%. People should never be really reaching their goals. Their goals should be providing a little bit of stretch. How do you think that works in an industry? And we spend a lot of time in the finance industry, and there are a lot of people who have alpha personalities in that in that industry who've never gotten a B in their life. So
Yes.
how do you balance setting goals that are telling people we're going to set your goal at, well beyond an A, but you're going to be getting a B, and how do you manage that?
That's amazing. Yes. I mean, I think that um, setting a culture of intelligent failure is super important. And I grabbed that from Adam Grant, actually. That's not mine. That's not mine. But really, the idea is, in the pursuit of failure is really when you learn the most.
Mm,
And I think if you can create that as a tenet of the culture in your organization, that incentivizes people to go for bold goals, right? Because if you say you're going to learn by doing this hard thing, and if you lead by example, also as a leader, you make mistakes and you are vulnerable and you show that making mistakes is okay, and you actually pronounce that, hey, during this mistake or during this journey, this is what I learned and this is why we're here today. I think those folks who are used to, getting those straight A's all the time, if they can get something out of it, incentivize them to essentially go for those bold goals and be okay with failure is how you should approach it. It's not easy. Like, let's just be real.
yeah,
You're always going to have folks who and we are always going to have folks who are so talented and are extremely accomplished, and that's where they're comfortable, and that's okay. I think that's okay. I think over time, you will again parent the child that you have, and that you'll start to
yeah.
see your workforce also self-select. So once you instill this culture of mistakes and intelligent failure, and that's sort of humming beneath the culture and the way that you create processes and success in the organization, I think people will start to feel more comfortable in being uncomfortable.
Thank you. And I second that wholeheartedly. I will also say that in a prior podcast that we were recording just a couple of days ago, the guest mentioned that there can be situations where the decision would have been right had the situation just been a little bit different. And sometimes so long as the decision making framework was good, then the learning can be very rich, even though sometimes the decision process was fine. And what you don't want are people who are accidental successors, because that just means that they won the lottery for all intents and purposes. They got the right outcome, but
Yeah.
didn't go through the right decision. So to that end, are there tips that you can give, perhaps some of our younger folks that are coming on and listening, to how to think about analyzing a problem and maybe deciding on what they should and how to start prioritizing things based on what you had said before?
Yeah. Um, First and foremost, talk to people. You can have all the data, you can have all the research at your fingertips, you can read all the books, but talk to people. Go outside of yourself and have a conversation with someone who has done it before, or even, just anyone in your network or in your circle that that works at a company or works at a job. I think that at the end of the day, we all go through similar problems when or actually similar challenges when we're trying to make choices and when we're trying to make decisions, whether it's between two job offers, or whether it's taking a promotion, or whether it's switching roles. I think that look around, pick your head up, and have a conversation in real life with someone around you, because chances are they've been through it. You can be a little bit more intentional about this too. Once you get comfortable with asking questions, I think it's super important to be able to do this a little bit in a more structured framework. Reach out to networks that are within your realm. There's so many great resources on LinkedIn, local associations, via Meetup. go in and start creating sort of a little bit of a foundation of people that are in your industry and are in your space, and where you want to go. I think that, those two things give you so much great anecdotal information that you won't be able to find, in a data set or a book or a spreadsheet or even a podcast. Like podcasts are excellent, but really having that energy, having a coffee with somebody or a drink or, whatever beverage you prefer, and having a conversation about the challenges that you're having and getting and hearing them, right? And hearing what their experience is, I think is like the low hanging fruit answer. But for me, it's been, hugely impactful in how I make choices and decisions, especially in my career.
So young people would benefit from being open to listening to the wisdom of people who are a little bit older, and older people maybe should be more open to the fact that while young people may not be exactly the way they were when they were younger, that there's still a lot that can be brought to the table by young people, and invest in mentoring or even having a rich conversation, and all it costs you was a half an hour and a cup of coffee.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've learned so much even from folks who are younger than me, folks that I've been their manager, or, being a person on, a few leadership teams. A lot of the time I learn most from the people that I've hired or the folks
Right.
that are on my team that are younger than me. So having some humility around that, and really accepting that you don't know everything, no matter how much experience you have, is super important. And everyone has really interesting perspectives. So going in it with a non-judgmental attitude, I think is probably, you'll do yourself a really big service in that light.
There's that show on TV, I think it's called Undercover Boss, where you take, C-level people and put them in the company doing line work. And it's remarkable to discover just how little. And by the way, like, I'm not saying this because I'm observing someone else doing it. Like, I see it in myself as a technologist who came up through the ranks doing what it is that I was doing all those years ago. And my job changed. And now when I need to go get thrown back into it, it's not easy to flip that switch. So to be able to listen to people who are experts in a particular area that you may have known years ago, but you don't really do today. And sometimes it's all about the timing as well.
Absolutely. One of the strategies that I've seen, a former CEO in a company that I was in implement was sort of this rotating customer service role. So everybody in the company would have to do customer support. And this, I think, came from Jeff Bezos, I think, in his early days of Amazon, where he, customer first is still sort of one of the tenets of Amazon. And you can kind of see that reverberate through the product offerings today. But initially with the book product offering, he had every employee, sit in as a customer support shift, on a weekly or monthly basis. And so one of our CEOs did the same thing. And this really created a level of not only empathy for folks that were more senior, that had to kind of do a little bit of the grunt work, but additionally more empathy for the customer, right? You're kind of behind a wall when you're serving your customers or your clients. And so creating sort of that holistic view of empathy, and that's how you essentially create process and create good decisions, is one of the ways that I've seen it done very effectively.
I love that. I think that I also heard that good decisions are very much informed by bad decisions. So
yes,
that's really the only way to learn. But so maybe we can speak a little bit more just for a moment. We spoke a little bit about transformational strategies. When we identify a particularly large problem, it's a goal over time, and we are looking to improve things. Can you speak maybe a little bit about how you tweak operations if you have a particular process that you realize that, okay, maybe I don't need to do a 25% overhaul of it, but I really just need to do a 1% tweak? How do you go by identifying where those breakdowns are, and is that even a good thing, or does it not make sense to proceed in those terms?
I think a lot of this comes down to communication and how people absorb information. So, coming from technology teams, where I've ranged the gambit of running operations for an entire organization down to data operations for, a technology team, and everything in between. And I realized that a lot of the time there's information silos. So, but what I mean by that in the context of, let's say, engineering or product, we had challenges in communicating what really we were working on because everything we were working on was so technical and the language that we used was so different from some of the business teams that were in the organization. So we had to find ways to be able to translate what we were working on back to what understandable objectives, right? And this again, goes back to the OKRs, goes back to goal setting and why important, how it's so important is that you can actually take something very technical that maybe a finance team or a technology team is working on. Or maybe we're doing a code refactor, or on the finance side, we're implementing a new finance software. Whatever it is, if you're not telling the rest of the organization why you're doing it and what goal it relates to, you're not going to get a lot of cooperation when you need it, right? When you're building something, especially internally. If your team are your internal customers, as we sort of talked about before, you need their cooperation in order to solve problems for them, especially as a technology team or especially as sort of an internal service team. So if you're not able to tell your stakeholders why you're doing the thing you're doing and what goal it relates to and why the success of that is going to be applicable to the success of the organization, you're going to have a communication challenge. So one of the things that I think we were successful in was implementing simple project management tooling. So things like, things like Asana, Atlassian, Trello, etc. Visual boards that track work that link back to, goals or reasons why you're working on them. And then also the pace at which they're being worked on. Um, and that really allowed our stakeholders on other teams to be able to understand and manage expectations really on when their deliverable was going to be done. So I would implore folks who are having challenges with communicating what they're working on to first get organized within their team, make sure that there's transparency into who's working on what and why, and then be able to package that information, in the context of a Confluence or a wiki or what have you, in order to have weekly or regular updates, with the external stakeholders so that they know the pace and why and the why.
It feels like you've been in a situation where you've tried to implement something that you clearly understood was here's the fix, and there was no buy-in from the rest of the team, and you arrived at communication.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was a challenge that I had, coming into, a data focused leadership role was, being able to talk to my cohorts and my fellow leadership and even the rest of the team on why technology and data is important in the first place,
Mm.
right? They're doing their jobs just fine in Excel, right? They're getting the work done. They're raising money. They're acquiring assets. They're doing everything they need to do in order to mark what they feel is successful. But there's sort of this philosophy of you can't measure what didn't happen. And that is a big part of what technology teams do, what IT teams and data teams do. They sort of prevent, they sort of are preventative measures or optimized measures, and they tend to be cost centers. And it's hard to measure the success of those implementations because they're usually saving time, and that time doesn't necessarily relate back to revenue and sort of hard metrics that a firm might have. It might go back to cost, but at the end of the day, you need to invest a lot in technology in order for it to glean the long term effects of it. So that was sort of one of the challenges that I really had to get buy-in, from the rest of the organization, to be able to tell them, hey, in 6 months to a year, this is going to make your life easier, but I can't necessarily measure right now for you how it will. So the first step in that was creating transparency around the work that we were doing, to make them understand that these things just don't happen like a light switch, that it takes time, it takes buy-in, it takes stakeholder participation, and it takes process setting, and it takes data measurement, right? If you have metrics, there's no point in having metrics if you can't measure them. So you have to instill processes to measure successes, right? To show that those metrics are actually measurable. So there's a lot of foundational work from an operations perspective that you have to put into place that centers around communication, in order to purvey that, what you're going to build and what you're going to do is going to make their lives easier.
And I would imagine that while that is not an easy sell because you can't really, as you said, measure that easily, measuring it is probably the best way to be able to illustrate the value. So to that end, any tricks that you've come up with to identify how to measure what matters?
Yeah, I mean, I think starting to, it all goes back to goals again. When you set your objective and then you set your key result, or, whatever framework you want to use, you start to look at how am I going to measure, the engagement that I'll get when I build this data dashboard, for example. I think that when you identify that you want to measure the success of something like engagement, you have to use a tool that can do that.
Right.
So, I think the first back at Dig, we didn't have any sort of BI really set up that was holistic of the whole organization. Each team was, managing their own metrics in their own platform. And so my job as the COO was to be able to compile, how these folks were measuring page views and engagement and lag time and SLAs into one place, and be able to kind of say, this is how it would, these are the mix of metrics that we need in order to define success, or this is how much we need to get, 10 million monthly active users. So I think the first thing is go at it manually. Like, that's fine. You don't need a big fancy tool to be able to start tracking what is going on inside of a team. So I think the first thing I would recommend is sit down with each team, understand what their goals are, how they're measuring them, help them start to create mechanisms to measure. It might be a spreadsheet, right? It might be putting down dates in one column and the actual metric in the second column, and manually putting in those numbers day by day. Let's start there. And then take that information and see how that can impact their goal, like in a macro sense. And that's when you start thinking of tools and start evaluating, software that might be out there that could help you kind of compile this information in one place. So don't be afraid to go manual. Like, don't be afraid to use Excel, and don't be afraid to kind of jump in and just start writing things down and documenting. And then as you start to sort of crystallize your approach, crystallize your goals, you can start using sort of graduated methods of measuring data, like a BI tool, like Power BI or Datadog or what have you.
Have you found sometimes that you're measuring something, or maybe when you were going through as a COO analyzing that the teams were measuring something and you just either felt or knew, or it was not really aligned with the ultimate goals? And if so, how do you go about helping the team recognize the fact that their baby, this particular measurement, is not really relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, quarterly check-ins with your goals is super important. I know it takes a lot of time. I know it's one of those things that is not at the forefront of day-to-day work that folks have to get done. However, this is where you start to clarify, pivot, and adjust the metrics that you need to be measuring. A metric that you were measuring last year may not be applicable anymore because the goal has shifted, right? We are, say, for example, you're, Series A, and all you're looking at is right now getting those customers and getting that money in and getting that revenue in. And then now you're a Series B company and you're in a growth stage. And yeah, you need to continue to maintain that customer base, but you also have to look at your cost efficiencies. You have to look at how you're going to scale, and you have to really look at the organization and make sure that you have the right people on the right bus, the right process in order to get to that next stage, in order to get to a scale. So from Series A to Series B, you're going to look like a totally different company, and you might not focus necessarily on raising money anymore. You're now going to focus on revenue or cost optimization or process optimization. So that's a huge shift in how you're going to measure metrics. And measuring metrics is fine and great if it's automatic, but if it starts to become cumbersome and starts to sort of become not at the focus of the goal, I think it's okay to pivot and be able to say, all right, our company goal is now to be able to have revenue projections that reach this, and we need to now, be able to put in some measurements to get those metrics, so that we can measure our successes.
And different companies in different stages clearly have different objectives. So reviewing your metrics and how they tie back to your goals is incredibly important as well, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Maybe at this point in the conversation, let's pivot a little bit to some of your passion projects outside of operations. I know we mentioned at the beginning that you work with women in technology and a couple of other items. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, a few years ago, I started to engage in, creative projects that spanned from, working in art collectives, and as well as in the music space and in the theatrical space. So these are just, folks that I started to meet when I moved to New York City, through friends of friends. And I've always had, I grew up as a Kathak dancer, which is Indian classical ballet, and had painted, and all of these different expressions of creativity have always been, something that has been near and dear to me. So coming to New York was an amazing exposure to that. And so I met, and so my entrance into doing this in the city was meeting, a young director named Katya Badalian, whose mother, was a prolific producer and director of ballets and theater in Russia. And she, emigrated to the US, and she started to do performance projects on her own. I was introduced to her, and she and I got together and we thought about doing this sort of very interactive piece called Eyes Closed. And the question that we talked about in all the conversations that we had were, how did dreams influence what people do every day, meaning your sleeping dreams?
Great question.
And we wanted to sort of showcase those stories somehow in the context of a New Yorker. So we put out some ads, and we got actors that came in, and we gave them a script of questions. And their job every week was to interview, 3 to 5 strangers or friends and ask them these questions about their dreams. And the theatrical piece was then centered around doing a verbatim technique, which means imitating that interview. So, we've asked CEOs, we've asked, unhoused, folks, we've asked, you're a blue collar worker, we've asked, food cart vendors, all these questions. And then the play essentially morphed into us acting those experiences. And we called it Eyes Closed. And that was my first foray really into the theatrical world. And we were able to do a couple of performances at Dixon Place Theater, and, sold out show. We did a Kickstarter. It was really, really amazing and touching. And I learned so much really about just what our city is made of and how we can use creativity to showcase those stories. So that was my first sort of foray into the creative world.
That is fantastic. Do you continue with that regularly?
So we did a second show as well. And now, because of meeting all of those actors in that context, I was connected with, that network essentially, and have now been able to work with musicians on creating storylines for videos, like so music videos, and doing sort of creative direction on what set design and storyline could be for a potential piece of content, like a video or an Instagram reel or a TikTok. And so that's been super fun. And then additionally, have been sort of mentoring and working on the technology side of things with women in operations and women in technology through organizations like Built by Girls, as well as doing personal mentorships with, women that are coming up in my industry that I've known, and I see them walking the same path, similar to me. So it's been great, mentoring those folks as well as, they bring so much into my life. They teach me so much about the things that I'm starting to be out of touch with. So yeah, just having that holistic approach, being someone in technology and finance, and having that balance of creativity is so important, and gives a lot to me in my life.
They
So, yeah.
probably self-inform as well. Meaning,
How do you mean?
so when you said, like, you go and ask a number of different people in the city questions about what their dreams are, and working with younger people to help them, forge down the path. It is, on the one hand, a creative experience. On the other hand, it also helps professionally and vice versa. Meaning, it's a circle.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. It's a flywheel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it kicks into, I think one of the misconceptions about people in technology and finance is that they're not as creative and they're more evidence-based and more data-driven. But that in itself is a creative endeavor,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're solving problems, with technology, and you have to get really creative about how you're going to do it. And I think sort of, using your other brain is a flywheel into being able to feed, how you're going to solve problems in a data evidence-based context. And then the same is true for when you apply that brain to when you're solving problems or getting creative in a creative context.
Which is a great segue into talking about how people in technology are in fact valuable, which leads directly into the next question. So what does the future hold in your opinion? There's a lot of new technologies that are on the market, everything from AIs or LLMs and various other algorithms, depends on what you call it and whatever, but you would be well positioned to share with us some views on what you think the future holds, both for the technology solutions, the technology benefits, as well as the people, and where are they going to fit in? Do they fit in? How does their creative outlet or various other solutions fit into this entire puzzle?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of fear around, just let's not even get into AI yet. There's a lot of fear around engaging with data. I think that it can be very intimidating for folks who are very gut driven and have great intuition, and data can sometimes tell you an opposite story.
Mm.
And so already I think there's a lot of trepidation. There's a little bit more, I think, of an appetite now that, it's been, 7 or 8 years that folks have been kind of pummeled with data, technology, and products. But there's still, just from my experience, there's still trepidation around, using data as a tool within an organization. And so now you layer on AI, right? And that can also feel intimidating and scary and could replace jobs and all of these sort of fears that I think people immediately go to in the sci-fi context in which we understand AI. However, I think that seeing sort of the twofold approach of AI, I'm only using that example right now because you had brought it up, but I have some other thoughts around it as well. But, there's product AI and there's operational AI. And right now we're seeing a lot of like hotness with product AI. There's a lot of folks that are, of course there's ChatGPT, and of course you have all of these sort of product feature forward technologies that are incorporating AI, whether it's on the back end or the front end, and they're everywhere. It's really everywhere. You click on any piece of technology right now, and there's an AI option, and I think that's great. I think where we're gonna see trends and more immersion is on the operational AI side, on how we use AI to actually optimize our internal processes. And that's not necessarily, around, predictive technology on your data, or doing things like that. I think it's going to be more around evaluating workforces. So again, there's a few companies out there that are messing with this a little bit, but I think we have a huge challenge with understanding who our teams are and what their strengths are. And I think a really wonderful application of AI that I'm starting to see an emerging trend in is using AI to essentially evaluate and train your teams into the abilities and skills that you might need in order to grow your company. So, I think this could be super beneficial to companies that don't have great educational or training infrastructures and frameworks where, where as your goals change as an organization, your skill sets also have to change. And so using AI to augment and to basically evaluate, a team member or a team and train them on leadership skills and management skills and things that they might need in order to grow based on the company's organizations, I think is going to start to become more of a trend.
So this is well beyond your standard, personality profiling.
100%. Yeah. And I think, personality profiling can get a little bit, I think it can be very challenging if it's not used correctly.
Sure.
I think there's some great personality tests out there. But things like the Kobe test is really great. But, one of the main takeaways from this is communication, right? How people communicate and receive information. And so if you're using AI technologies that are, sort of based on training and education, you're able to hone in on those communication methods. One employee might be better at, communicating verbally and might be better at receiving information when it's put in a certain context. Or another is, sort of better at evidence-based and data-based information. So if you start to learn sort of these traits on how people learn and communicate, I think you can use AI in a very beneficial way to reach people, to reach them where they are, and communicate goals and be able to extract, the value that you don't even know that they can provide.
I want to thank you very much because I think you've just enriched an idea that I had a couple of weeks ago. I was thinking about using AI to develop a curriculum for myself on what I should read and how I should learn the next set of technologies. So for me, it was more around technology and technology leadership. And let's say it easily is, what would a CIO need to know in order to be a CIO of a mid-market company? And kind of build a curriculum around that with readings and exercises as if I was going to my own college that AI developed for me. And this was a very clever idea. And I think I'm in the middle of like week 6 at the moment, or at least building the curriculum. But what I think you said, which is I think even richer, is taking the personality profile, learning what the strengths are and layering in the learning in a way that is acceptable, adaptable. People can like resonate with the learning on that level. I think that's very cool.
Absolutely. And when you do that, you start to see purpose, right? When a person is able to understand their strengths and weaknesses, and then they're also empowered to hone in on those strengths and weaknesses and sort of address their challenges, they start to have a level of purpose in an organization, and work starts to become rewarding. I think that we have a huge challenge right now with Gen Z and millennials and, folks that are coming into workplaces and they're really questioning why, these frameworks are there. Why am I in this job? Why is it structured this way? And I think it's a really great exercise for us as leaders and managers to really try to look at our teams holistically and look at people in a holistic manner so they have a level of purpose when they're coming, to their job. That it's not just about, coming in and, making money, which is, again, a huge, huge priority, but coming in and just doing your job and going home. There's like an element of how do we make you feel like you're here for a purpose and that you bring value, and that, your job can actually become rewarding. And so learning our people, learning our team as humans, using, AI technologies and training and all of this infrastructure, I think actually accentuates that and extracts that.
Yeah, the communication message that you're delivering, I think, resonates very, very strongly. I'll also say that it's incredibly timely because in the world that we live in, whether you look at politics or anything else, it's so fractured. And one of the things that I can't speak to everybody in the world, but I feel like we don't listen as much. It's okay to disagree
Definitely.
respectfully. That's okay. But listen and at least hear what the other person is saying, because there may be some value there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one thing that I could change in the human race is probably dehumanization, right? Looking at somebody and not immediately humanizing them, right? I think then there's like a trickle down effect of, equality and non-judgment and all of that other stuff. But yeah, you said it. You hit the nail on the head. I think that just listening and hearing people is really important.
I think that's very, very important. And I agree with you that the dehumanization effect that happens quite a bit is it's dangerous. It's just very dangerous.
Absolutely.
Whether it be Lord of the Flies or whatever the book du jour is, excuse me, that's where that's where these things tend to go, at least in my very limited observation of history. So, but maybe just one last question. And again, you can feel free to share or not. So, what does the next chapter look for you, Naima?
Yeah, it's a great question that, I think we all ask ourselves pretty much on a periodic basis. And, I have since parted ways with ITE Labs and am joining forces with my sister to start a portfolio of companies that, speak to us. So, my sister has been an entrepreneur and a franchisee owner of several franchisees through her career. And, knowing what I have learned from managing different teams and being in different industries, I think we are now ready to be, take our own fate and start our own thing and be at the head of our own thing. And I'm super excited about that. I think that, all the lessons I've learned from, working in all these amazing organizations, I'm standing on the shoulders of others right now. And I really want to take that and bring that forward and pay that forward, in my own thing. So, yeah, that's kind of the next step. I want to go at it with a lot of intention, and I want to go at it with the culture lessons that I've learned, and being able to do it with my sister is pretty amazing. So yeah, that's what's next for me.
I think that's super exciting to be able to build something of value with family and be able to create a merger of entrepreneurship with process and being able to grow businesses is incredibly rewarding.
Yes,
I have
absolutely.
no doubt that you will be incredibly successful, and I wish you enormous amounts of success.
Oh gosh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. And just in the way of wrapping up here, I'd like to thank you, Naima. I think the insights that you've shared have been valuable to me, and I certainly hope that our listeners would value that. If you want to contact Naima, and Naima would be looking for certain kinds of opportunities, would you want to share how people could and should reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. You all can check out my LinkedIn. It's just my first name and my last name. I'm pretty responsive there. I love sharing ideas in a social context. So drop me a comment on a post or add me on a post, and I love sort of looking at different ways to create dialogue on all matters. So reach out to me on LinkedIn, and let's have some good conversations.
Sounds great, Naima. Thank you so much. And again, I am incredibly grateful that you've joined us today, and I appreciate all the wisdom that you've shared with us. So much of it is just timeless, and as you said all the way at the beginning of the show, it's just about the way it represents itself. So I'd like to thank also our sponsor. Ventures and Visionaries is sponsored by KJ Technology. KJ Technology provides advisory, cybersecurity, and proactive process consulting services. KJ also provides full managed IT services. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Please send an email to info@kjtechnology. And once again, Naima, thank you so much for today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Great conversation, Mordy.